Dr. Friedman, what about this midway path?
Well, first of all, I utterly reject what Sam says about the results of Ronald Reagan's changes. We've had a decade of extraordinary growth, increase in employment, in which inflation was brought down sharply. Ronald Reagan came into office at a period of very high inflation and so on. But this program is not about the Reagan administration. This program is about Eastern Europe, and I want to go to Eastern Europe. I believe Sam is completely wrong in saying that the model I propose is outdated. I believe that what he calls obsolete is something very different. You have had the third way. You've had it in the United States, you've had it in Sweden, you've had it in Britain, you've had it elsewhere. In every case, it's been built on the foundation of a long period of what I call the first way. The United States had 150 years of essentially a free private market before it launched on this period of the welfare state. Same thing was true in Britain. The same thing is true in Sweden. I believe he will find it very difficult to cite any example of a country which started from a very low level and immediately adopted that combination of policies.
Yeah, well, let me add something on that. I think the lesson that we learned from what happened in Eastern Europe goes beyond simply that central planning doesn't work. I think we all agree it doesn't work. But it's more than that. It's the role of private property in the system and the incentives provided by private property. I mean, I don't know what socialism means anymore, but I remember when I was in Poland and I asked the head of the ideology department, is private property consistent with socialism? He said it may be. And then I asked him, well, what's the difference between socialism and capitalism? And his answer was, we're still working on that. I mean, I think what we've seen is a rejection of the ideas associated with traditional socialism, which are suppression of private property, government ownership of property, and so on. Now, how far should we move in the other direction? And I think that's the question you're asking, Sam. And is there a middle way? I think the middle ways that have been successful have all been largely reliant on private property, private ownership, private incentives. The difficult question is the one that Milton raised in the documentary. How far can you redistribute income and make it consistent with effective incentives? I don't think we know the boundary point there, where the 30% of the income being redistributed is too much, 40%, 50%. My own feeling is that we've gone much too far in Sweden and some of the other Scandinavian countries, and they're beginning to step back from this. They're lowering maximum tax rates to 50% now. They were up to 80%. So I think there is a third way, but that third way is going to be a lot closer to unregulated markets than toward a socialist organization of resources and a suppression of private property.
Let's get back to the particulars. So, I mean, you talk about Sweden and you talk about the third way failing, and Milton says nobody's ever really gotten rich on the third way. They've only benefited from that. Let's talk about the United States. The period you describe included a very long period in which the United States was a highly protectionist country, in which our industrial base was developed from Alexander Hamilton on for some time, and then during the late 19th and early 20th century. To call that a free market solution would be against everything you've taught. Or, if one wants to go back into the 19th century, the huge subsidies of the railroads were, of course, an intervention in the market. Now, these are...
Look,
let me continue, Milton. In the case of England that you talk about, the same is true. The role of the British Navy and the role, for example, of the Parliament in actually establishing the private property, which is what you favor. This was done by a government intervention. And if we talk about the other cases, talk about Sweden, or let's talk about Korea. These are two countries which I think are justly admired for their economic performance. Both countries have income distributions far more equal than the United States. In Sweden, over half the GNP is taxed. Now, people in this country would say, well, it's obvious they've gone too far. But let's look at the test of the market. Sweden and Korea have been defeating the United States in world markets. Exports have grown 5% per year during the Reagan-Bush years. In Sweden, in the United States, they've grown 1% per year. In Korea, we know they've grown much better. If you want to go on to Norway, where much of the investing is done by the government, they've grown their exports even faster than Sweden. Meanwhile, we can't compete in world markets. But so the lesson of these countries is, if you look at the facts, Milton, a combination of government regulation and the market works. I agree with Gary. I think private property is extremely important because the incentives associated with owning the results of your work is essential. But private property does not mean that we have to let the market go unregulated. And all the evidence is that the countries that are beating us in the world markets today don't do it. They're not that dumb. Japan doesn't do it. Korea doesn't do it. Sweden doesn't do it.
Let's not throw straw men around. Obviously, I am not in favor of no government. Government has some very important roles to play. Those are very limited. You take the case of the United States during the 19th century and of Britain in the 19th century. At the time of Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1899, total government spending in Britain was 10% of the national income. Throughout the up until 1929 in the United States, except for periods of Great War, total government spending in the United States was about 10% of national income. Now that's a very far cry from a government which spends over half the national income, as is true in Britain, and a little less than half in the United States. Similarly,
you are opposed to capital controls. You're opposed to telling people they can't move their money internationally. That's what Korea does. You're opposed to...
Absolutely, and I think Korea makes a mistake by doing it.
Well, Korea has beaten us by exactly the policies that you're opposing.
And so has Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has beaten us by the policies I'm proposing.
Well,
so we have to, and besides beating us,
Milton,
I don't
interpret that there is no middle way. And if Korea is not a middle way and Sweden's not a middle way, then I'd like to know what you'd call it.
Korea is a lot closer to a market-oriented economy than any of the economies we've been talking about.
The government approves the heads of the banks in Korea.
It does.
They nationalize their steel industry and have one of the most efficient plants in the world at Pohang. I mean, you know, if you call that a private economy, I don't think Milton...
What fraction of resources in Korea goes through the government?
A tremendous fraction if you take account of the fact that the banks are centrally run and they control the credit allocations there, and they don't let people take their money out of the country.
I'd like to bring this discussion back to the United States for a moment. What about socialism in the United States? There has been one area where we have tried to redistribute wealth. We have done that through our welfare policies, through Social Security. Has that worked?
Some people have benefited, but taken as a whole, I think it's been a failure.
I agree with that. I think the big problem in the United States has been, of course, some of the welfare programs have been successful, but by trying to do too many things, the United States the government is no longer doing the things that it should be doing. We all agree there are many things government should be doing, and I agree with Milton. It's a straw man to say there's an issue between no government and 100% government. The question is, what are the tasks that government should be doing? And I believe the tasks are, of course, defense against outside aggression, internal protection, and some infrastructure, protection of the people who can't make it, a safety net. And every one of these areas, we're not doing very well. And I think we're not doing well mainly because we're trying to do a lot of things we shouldn't be doing. And they can't do all of them.
I couldn't help but think, Dr. Bowles, as I watched that film, that the public housing area, the public housing that we saw in Eastern Europe and the problems that we have here in the United States, aren't there some lessons to be learned?
Oh, there's absolutely no reason why housing shouldn't be privately owned. That does not mean that the government has no role in housing. It seems to me housing is precisely something that ought to be a matter of private property. But we also know, from the experience of this country, that the market itself doesn't provide housing that the rest of the public thinks is adequate for the vast majority of poor people in this country. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be done by the government building the houses, but it certainly does mean that something has to be done, or we're going to have the kind of homeless crisis that we have in this country, and they're getting one in Eastern Europe, too.